I wanted to ask you a few questions about why did you decide to write about that subject?
The order was delivered without ceremony, without warning, and without the protection of carefully prepared palace language. King Charles had suspended Camilla's role from all private decisions connected to Diana's estate, legacy, and surviving family interests. The announcement stunned the royal household, but the reason behind it was even more devastating. A newly authenticated instruction from Diana's final will had exposed a truth the palace could no longer bury. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles sat alone with the authenticated appendix open before him, reading the same paragraph twice because the first reading had left him breathless. The appendix, a sealed edition attached to a will, had been found inside a solicitor's archived case file and verified through signatures, dates, and records. It carried instructions never fully shown to William or Harry, and those words governed access to their mother's possessions, letters, memorial arrangements, and maternal inheritance. The king's hand tightened around the page when he reached Diana's warning. She had demanded that no future spouse of Charles be allowed to influence how her belongings were handled, displayed, removed, or interpreted. The language was direct. It left no room for custom, comfort, or quiet intervention. He understood this was not merely about objects. It was about whether her sons could trust the crown to protect the final boundaries their mother had drawn. Camilla entered the private sitting room, expecting a routine discussion, and stopped when she saw the empty chair beside him. Charles did not invite her to sit. He explained that he had signed a temporary royal directive, a formal order limiting her access, and that she was suspended from every advisory duty linked to Diana's estate and legacy. Her face hardened, then softened, as shock and humiliation arrived together. The queen consort asked whether he believed she had acted against Diana deliberately. He placed his pen beside the signed order and finally met her eyes. This was not punishment, he said. It was a correction, one that should have been made long ago. Camilla later stated in a recorded conversation preserved in the household file that she had believed she was protecting the monarchy from renewed pain. Charles replied that protection had become interference. Then another message arrived. William was informed that a second sealed page had been located, and its contents could explain why Diana's instruction had remained hidden for years. But before William could confront the person who had crossed his mother's final boundary, he first had to understand what Charles, Camilla, and Diana had each been protecting, and what each of them now stood to lose. This was never only about a legal document. It was about a marriage that collapsed before the world, a love that survived at an unbearable cost, and two sons forced to inherit the silence left behind. Charles faced the memory of a woman he had failed. Camilla faced the shadow she could never escape. William faced the possibility that his mother's final wishes had been quietly weakened inside the very institution meant to protect them. William stood motionless in the private library, the telephone still pressed against his palm after the call had ended. He had heard the exact wording of Diana's instruction, and each sentence carried the force of a warning sent across time. The will, a legal record explaining how a person's property and wishes should be handled after death, now felt less like paperwork and more like proof that his mother had expected resistance. Charles understood why the words cut so deeply. He was not only the sovereign correcting an administrative failure, he was Diana's former husband, confronting evidence that her distrust had survived their divorce and reached beyond her life. The king knew the discovery mattered because it threatened William's faith in him as a father, not merely his confidence in the crown. The past was no longer safely buried. Camilla returned alone to her rooms and removed a brooch with trembling fingers. She placed it on the table, dismissed her aide, and asked not to be disturbed. Years of public acceptance, carefully rebuilt respect, and hard-won authority now rested beneath the shadow of a document, suggesting Diana had anticipated interference from the woman Charles would one day marry. William began remembering decisions he had once dismissed as palace caution. Diana's letters had been delayed. Several dresses had disappeared from proposed displays. Memorial objects had been moved after advice from Camilla's household, even though her office held no formal authority over his mother's estate. Each memory now felt connected, and each connection deepened his anger. Charles later admitted during a recorded private call that he had approved some of those arrangements. He told his son he believed he was preventing renewed family conflict, not violating Diana's intentions. William answered carefully, but the restraint in his voice frightened the king more than shouting would have. Then the prince received one final detail. A specific palace ceremony had caused the archived will to be reopened, and Camilla's intervention during that event had triggered everything. The suspension may have been signed in a single afternoon, but its true beginning lay in one carefully controlled ceremony, where a missing object, an unexpected instruction, and Camilla's quiet intervention pushed the family beyond the point of return. Months before the suspension, the palace had gathered for what was supposed to be a dignified tribute to Diana's humanitarian legacy. The guest list was approved, the speeches were restrained. Every detail had been designed to avoid controversy. Then William noticed that one deeply personal object had vanished from the display. His question seemed simple. The answer exposed a chain of private decisions and led directly to the sealed instructions inside Diana's final will. William stopped before the memorial display and immediately understood what was missing. His mother's handwritten field journal had been approved for the Diana Humanitarian Legacy reception at St. James's Palace, a formal gathering created to honor her charitable work. The journal mattered because it contained her private reflections on motherhood, public service, and the future she imagined for William and Harry. Without it, the tribute felt carefully polished, but emotionally hollow. The prince found the exhibition coordinator moments before the guests entered and asked who had ordered its removal. The coordinator hesitated, then admitted, in a documented account prepared after the reception, that Camilla's office had warned several passages could create unnecessary comparison between Diana and the current queen. William's anger sharpened because no trustee had approved the change, and no member of Diana's family had been consulted. Camilla later spoke to Charles in a recorded private conversation preserved in the Household Review. She insisted she had tried to protect the monarchy from an evening consumed by old wounds. The queen consort feared that Diana's words would turn a charitable tribute into a public judgment of her marriage. Charles accepted the explanation, believing restraint would keep the family from reopening pain. William saw something far darker, another attempt to control his mother's voice. The archivist refused to let the matter disappear. She searched the original estate authorization, a written record showing who could approve the use of Diana's personal material, and found a reference to an unseen appendix. That appendix restricted any future royal spouse from altering, removing, or interpreting the late princess's belongings without the approval of her sons and trustees. Then a retired solicitor broke his silence through a signed statement. He confirmed that the appendix had been stored separately because its language was considered too inflammatory after Diana's death. Yet its legal standing had never been cancelled. William demanded a face-to-face meeting with Camilla as soon as authentication was complete. Charles heard the request and knew he could no longer stand between his son and the truth. The hidden appendix had reopened the past, but it was William's decision to confront Camilla directly that transformed an old wound into the most dangerous family reckoning of Charles's reign. There were no secretaries in the room, no communications advisors waiting to soften the language, and no cameras to force royal restraint. William entered carrying a copy of Diana's instruction. Camilla remained beside the fireplace, determined not to retreat. Charles stood between them for only a moment before realizing that this confrontation belonged to the son and the woman he believed had repeatedly stepped into his mother's unfinished story. William crossed the private Windsor sitting room and placed the authenticated instruction on the table. The document had been formally verified as genuine through signatures, dates, and archived records. Only the prince, the queen consort, and the king were present, which mattered because no official could interrupt, soften a confession, or hide behind palace procedure. He asked her one question: did she know she had no authority to remove the journal? Camilla held his gaze and admitted she had requested its withdrawal. She said in the recorded household account that her purpose had been to protect Charles from renewed humiliation and stop the reception from becoming another public trial of their marriage. The Queen insisted she had feared old pain would overwhelm the charity being honored, yet William heard only an excuse built around his father's comfort. The prince pushed Diana's instruction toward her. Protecting Charles, he said, did not give anyone the right to silence his mother. His voice stayed controlled, but the restraint carried more force than anger. She had crossed the exact boundary Diana feared would be ignored, and the future king would not allow that boundary to be treated as a suggestion. Camilla then revealed, through the same recorded conversation, that the journal was not the first concern she had raised. She had advised against releasing several private letters because they questioned Charles's choices as a father. The admission changed the room. What had looked like one intervention now appeared to be a pattern hidden for far too long. Charles finally spoke. He admitted that he had approved some of those decisions, believing he was preventing further conflict. William's anger turned cold. His father had not been unaware. The monarch had helped weaken the protection Diana created for her sons. William demanded an independent review, a formal examination conducted by people outside the immediate household, and left before either could answer. Charles remained beside Camilla, forced to decide whether loyalty meant defending his wife or facing the truth denied to his children. William had made his accusation, and Camilla had revealed more than anyone expected. But the next battle would not be fought through emotion alone, because the authority to decide her future rested inside a hidden structure of advisors, trustees, and royal power. By sunrise, the crisis had moved beyond the family. Private secretaries examined old approvals. Trustees reopened sealed correspondence. Legal advisors traced every decision made in Diana's name. Yet at the center of that machinery sat one exhausted man. Charles understood that every document pointed toward the same conclusion. Camilla's involvement had crossed a boundary. What remained uncertain was whether he had the strength to make her suspension permanent. Charles entered the council room carrying the weight of both husband and sovereign. He alone held the immediate authority to suspend Camilla's informal advisory access, while independent trustees controlled Diana's personal estate material, and William held standing as her elder son and beneficiary. That balance mattered, because no private marriage, however powerful, could erase the rights attached to Diana's legacy or the trust her sons had placed in the crown. The king took his seat before the review panel. The group included his private secretary, Diana's estate trustee, an independent archivist, and a senior constitutional advisor, meaning an expert who judged how royal power should be used within established rules. One by one, they read the disputed actions aloud. The missing journal, delayed letters, altered display notes, and restricted access to personal objects. Each item sounded small, alone. Together, they formed a pattern. Charles did not interrupt. He listened as Camilla's name appeared beside decisions she had never been formally entitled to shape. The monarch's silence deepened when the trustee explained why the matter threatened more than reputation. If Diana's wishes could be quietly weakened, William might conclude that palace loyalty mattered more than a mother's final instructions. The meeting ended, but Charles remained behind with the trustee. In a documented account prepared for the audit, he admitted that defending Camilla had often felt inseparable from defending the choices that shaped his own life. The trustee answered that love could explain his hesitation, but it could not excuse institutional interference. Then the archivist returned with a handwritten notation. Diana's restrictive appendix had been flagged years earlier, yet a palace official classified it as personally inflammatory and stopped it from reaching senior review. Records showed that the same official later joined Charles's household. The discovery raised a darker possibility. The appendix had not been forgotten. It had been contained to protect the future king from embarrassment. Charles authorized a full audit before leaving the room. He signed without looking up, unaware that the first ruling would reach Camilla before anyone had prepared her for its force. The king believed he had ordered a review of the past, but by the end of that day, the review had begun dismantling Camilla's present, room by room, meeting by meeting, privilege by privilege. The consequences arrived quietly. No public guards changed position. No announcement echoed through the palace corridors. Instead, Camilla's name disappeared from briefing papers. Meetings were reassigned. Archive access was cancelled. A private reception she had planned to lead was handed to another royal. Each change seemed administrative on its own, but together they delivered a brutal message. The suspension was no symbolic gesture. Her authority was being removed in real time. Camilla entered the household briefing expecting tension, but not erasure. Her usual chair was gone, and the papers beside that place had been removed. An aide quietly explained that the meeting now fell outside her authorized role. The restriction covered Diana-related archives, estate briefings, memorial planning, charitable legacy discussions, and consultations concerning William and Harry's maternal inheritance. Those limits mattered because they cut her off from the very areas where private influence had once carried weight. Sophie received the next instruction with visible unease. She was asked to represent the crown at a charitable reception connected to Diana's former patronages, meaning the causes and organizations the late princess had officially supported. The trusted confidant understood what the reassignment meant. Royal duty would continue without Camilla, and the palace wanted the public to see continuity rather than collapse. Sophie accepted, but she knew the queen would hear the decision as humiliation. Camilla returned to Charles and asked whether he intended to erase every part of the life they had built together. The king did not answer quickly. He told her their marriage could not be protected by ignoring Diana's written wishes, because doing so would cost him William's trust and deepen the wound already carried by both sons. She heard duty in his words, but also regret. Then the audit uncovered something worse. A documented draft from Camilla's office showed that a future Diana memorial statement had been edited to remove one line describing the late princess as the emotional center of her son's childhood. William read the altered wording in silence. The prince understood that the crisis was no longer about one missing journal. It revealed a long pattern of controlling how his mother's place inside the family was remembered. For William, the removal transformed suspicion into proof, and grief into a demand that could no longer be delayed. Camilla began preparing to leave Windsor for several days. Before she could depart, Charles asked for one final private conversation, without titles, advisors, or royal protection. The palace had already delivered its punishment, but the true turning point would come when Charles and Camilla faced each other not as king and queen, but as two people forced to decide whether love could survive an unforgiving truth. For the first time since the crisis began, there was no document between them. Charles entered the room without a red box, without an advisor, and without the careful language of monarchy. Camilla had already removed several personal belongings from the adjoining suite. She expected another judgment. Instead, the king sat opposite her and admitted that he had spent years confusing the defense of their love with the defense of every decision made in its name. Camilla remained silent as the door closed behind them. They were alone in a private room at Windsor, with no secretary, lawyer, or courtier available to carry the burden of what came next. A red box, the case used to deliver official papers to the monarch, had been deliberately left outside. Charles wanted this conversation to belong to two people before it belonged to the crown. The king told her the independent review would continue, and that her suspension from every Diana-related matter would become permanent. Her other public duties might return, but she would never again influence memorials, estate records, private letters, clothing, jewelry, or charitable archives connected to the late princess. The decision mattered because William's trust had been damaged, and because Diana's sons had been forced to defend boundaries their mother could no longer defend herself. Camilla finally spoke. In a recorded private account prepared for the review, she admitted that fear had guided her choices. She feared Diana's memory would always expose the pain beneath their marriage and make every moment of public acceptance feel temporary. The queen consort said she had tried to protect the life she and Charles had fought to build, but he answered that Diana's legacy had never belonged to them to reduce. Charles lowered his voice and admitted the interference had cost him something deeper than reputation. It had weakened William's faith in him as a father. It had also taught both sons that silence inside the palace could become another form of control. Camilla then made the decision he had not expected. She offered to surrender all remaining influence rather than challenge the ruling. She handed him a documented list of every occasion her office had intervened, allowing each decision to be corrected openly instead of uncovered one by one. Neither of them could hide behind duty now. Charles accepted the pages, called William, and asked him to return, not for another confrontation, but to witness the act that would finally restore Diana's final wishes. Camilla's surrender changed the crisis from a battle over power into a reckoning over memory, and when William returned, the palace was forced to reveal the decision to a world already gathering outside its gates. The story escaped the palace before the official statement was ready. Within minutes, broadcasters abandoned scheduled programming, newspapers rebuilt their front pages, crowds moved toward the royal gates, drawn by a decision that reopened one of Britain's most painful memories. Yet one public image came to define the moment. A woman standing outside Kensington Palace, holding a faded photograph of Diana, while the suspension announcement played from a stranger's telephone. William watched the first broadcast in silence, as Catherine stood beside him. The palace had issued a formal statement confirming Camilla's permanent exclusion from decisions concerning Diana's estate, personal legacy, memorial material, and her son's maternal inheritance. An estate meant the property, possessions, and legal interests left after someone's death. The ruling mattered because it restored control to Diana's sons and ended the private influence that had weakened their trust. The prince did not move when the presenter read Diana's restriction aloud. He lowered his head, then looked back at the screen without blinking. Catherine remained close, understanding that this was not victory for him. It was recognition arriving years too late, and it forced William to hear his mother's final fears spoken publicly before millions. Camilla sat alone when another broadcaster called the decision Charles's most painful act of accountability. The Queen switched off the television before her name was repeated. She remained his wife and would retain separate public responsibilities, but the authority challenged by Diana's instruction had ended completely. For Camilla, the distinction offered dignity without escape. She kept her marriage, yet lost the power that had placed it in conflict with the dead. By evening, one newspaper front page had captured the national mood. Diana's last wish honored, stretched above photographs of Charles, Camilla, and William, each image divided by a black line. The headline turned a private family reckoning into a public verdict, and the separation between their faces made the cost impossible to ignore. Outside Kensington Palace, people placed white roses beside the gates. One handwritten card carried 6 words: "Her sons finally heard her." The message reached Charles through a documented palace briefing, and the king read it twice before setting the page down. For him, those 6 words carried more force than any judgment delivered inside the palace walls. Then Charles called William and Camilla back to Windsor. He wanted one final settlement, not another temporary order. A decision meant to end the conflict rather than preserve resentment for another generation. The nation had delivered its judgment in headlines, flowers, and silence, but only one final act remained. Charles had to decide whether the monarchy would merely acknowledge Diana's wishes or fully repair what had been taken from them. The final meeting did not end with victory. It ended with recognition. Charles sat beside the document that had forced his family to confront decades of pain. William carried the burden of a son who had spent too long defending his mother's place. Camilla entered knowing that part of her royal influence would never return. What followed was not reconciliation without consequence. It was something harder, cleaner, and finally honest. Charles signed the permanent settlement with a hand that did not tremble, though every word carried the weight of what had been denied. The settlement, a binding agreement fixing who held authority, placed Diana's private possessions, correspondence, memorial representation, and estate legacy under William, Harry, independent trustees, and a neutral archivist. It mattered because her sons would no longer depend on palace permission to defend their mother's memory, and because no private marriage could again override her written wishes. The king handed the signed pages to William and apologized for more than the recent interference. He admitted in the recorded meeting account that he had believed silence could protect the family from consequences created long ago. The prince accepted the document without triumph. Respecting Diana, he said, did not require humiliating Camilla, but it did require a permanent end to every attempt to soften, hide, or reshape her voice. Camilla then placed her own written confirmation beside the settlement. She would not challenge the ruling. The Queen also returned the withheld field journal and authorized the restoration of every memorial record altered by her office. Her surrender did not erase the hurt, but it ended the struggle over who controlled the past. William carried the journal into the Diana Archive, a protected collection preserving her personal records and belongings. He placed it beside the authenticated appendix, ensuring that her words and final boundaries could never again be separated for convenience. Charles remained beside him. Camilla stepped back without protest. The prince closed the archive case himself. No one tried to reinterpret Diana's intention. No one protected the crown from the truth. Accountability had not saved them from pain, but it had stopped that pain from governing one more generation again. Camilla's Diana-related role was permanently ended. William's authority was restored. Charles accepted responsibility for allowing private fear to become institutional interference. Diana's final will had not destroyed the monarchy. It had forced the people inside it to stop hiding from the cost of their choices, and in honoring her last boundary, they finally gave her memory the dignity, protection, and peace it had been denied. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.